A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, welcome everybody. Today we're with Shira Chess. Shira Chess is an associate professor of entertainment and media studies at the University of Georgia. She's the author of Play Like a Feminist, which is really what we're going to focus on today, and Ready Player 2, Women Gamers and Designed Identity. Her work explores how video games are designed for and marketed to women audience and larger themes of leisure disparities. First of all, Shira, welcome to the show. Yeah. What are larger themes of leisure disparity? So is this essentially how, let's say, different genders tend to enjoy their leisure time? Is that the idea?
Sure. I mean, that's more or less where it started. And my perspectives on this before and during, I guess I shouldn't say after, but during the pandemic have also continued to shift. And but early on in my research, when I was sort of still working in the PhD part of when I was long before Ready Player 2, one of the things that really began to strike me was the way casual games are designed versus the way the research that has been done on women's leisure in general, right? Like how that research on women in leisure, a field that, feminist leisure studies was a field that began around the 1980s or so, where it was sort of, there was a lot of discussion about how women's leisure tended to be things that could be done in shorter snippets of time, or like things that were meant to fill all of allowable time, right? So things that could be done in short snippets of time or longer periods of time, depending on where you were at, right? Things that were cheap or free, things that were easy to learn and sort of easy to entangle or disentangle yourself from, and often had like themes of productivity. And I was really struck with the fact that casual gaming really emulated those patterns. So specifically, right? I mean, most casual games really almost exactly fall into that definition of women's leisure. And while casual games were not necessarily automatically meant for women audiences, there was definitely this sense that women were one of the primary target markets. And so a lot of my early work was really interrogating those disparities and thinking about how our leisure practices are enculturated, how we're taught to leisure in certain ways, how we teach ourselves to leisure in certain ways. And then increasingly, I mean, when I think about leisure inequality and play inequality, I mean, it's really, it's so much more intersectional than that, because the reality is that if you're working two jobs and are a full-time parent and are, and also are a woman, you don't have leisure time like at all, right? And so there was a right, like, I mean, it is condescending of us to say, well, you should play more games to somebody who doesn't have that space in their lives. So, I mean, largely, I think about leisure as an issue of equality. I think about it as a space where, as feminists, we talk a lot about equality in all different kinds of spaces, in terms of bodies, in terms of autonomy, in terms of workplaces, and all kinds of issues of gravity. But often we don't take that step back and ask ourselves the question, well, what about issues of leisure? What about, are we all getting quality leisure in our lives? And that is, I think, an issue of, great importance.
It is really interesting that, until I read at least part of your book, I never really thought of the fact that men and women I always knew men and women have fun in different ways, but I didn't think they were qualitatively different. I always thought maybe it's just, they're interested in different things, but I never thought about let's see. So in your book, you say that the playful is political. right?
Mhm.
I don't. Is this going to count as right? So we used to think of playing simply as just fun. Is this an
I just want
example
to
of
respond
this?
to
Right.
before
Okay.
I respond to that. I do
Right.
want to respond to one other thing. So
Okay.
I don't know that men and women do have qualitatively different leisure experiences so much as
Mm.
we're enculturated to see leisure differently, right? Like
Yeah.
in our cultures, we talk about leisure in different ways. Early on in my when I was originally very early on when I was a PhD student. I used to drive my mother crazy. I used to call her and I'm like, what would it take to make you play a video game? What would it take? What would it take? And one day she was like, I don't know, Shira, how about a nice shopping game? And like that, but that really struck me, right? Like
Yeah.
that this idea of, consumerism as leisure is both bizarre and also really enculturated into our lives. When you watch television commercials, you see commercials of women on the hunt for a bargain, right? And that's considered this leisure activity in a weird sense of it. So I think that a lot of like sort of my early work was grappling with that. It's not necessarily that men are from Mars, women are from Venus so much as we're taught certain things. We're taught to we're enculturated in certain ways and we emulate those practices often, but we're not like different necessarily.
Right.
And there are men that like casual games and that like productive leisure, and there are women that
And like shopping.
So right, exactly. I mean, I think that it's messier than I think the enculturation allows for sometimes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's still not there and it's still not an expectation that's built into how we do things.
Do you think that like telling women that women like to shop is much like Tom Sawyer, like getting all of his friends to paint the fence for him?
I mean, and there's a long history of sort of like of consumer spaces telling women that they like to shop, right? Like that is a pretty robust history. Women have long been the primary shoppers in most sort of cisgendered households, right? Like that is a construction that has been going on for a long time now, really since I think around the 40s or so. That was or maybe before, but the ones that I'm thinking of, some of the early ones really came from that period. So I mean, like that's longstanding.
Yeah. Interestingly, I only just recently read something about the history of department stores, and they're also tied directly to this. They're directly tied to when women became the primary shoppers of the family.
Right, exactly. And so, and there's, I've also studied some advertising for video games, and I always am amused how that gets reflected in advertising. And there's one ad that I really liked, from several, I think it was from about 2014 or 2015, something like that. That was a GameStop ad, and it was a Christmas ad, and it starts off where it shows, and I talk about it in Ready Player 2, but it shows a woman, like middle-aged white woman, in business casual clothing, driving in her minivan, and as she's driving home, there's like the van is like thumping lowrider style, and like she's passing by various people, and like she gives somebody a gang sign, and like she gives a dirty look to a cop that she passes by, and then in the end she like pulls into her driveway in White House white picket fence kind of driveway, and and then opens up the back of her car, and there's like a ton of GameStop games all through the back, and the tagline is "Roll home fat this Christmas." Make your family happy, right? Like, and that was, so it's like, one of the allowable spaces in the game industry for women is this specter of consumption, and this idea that like, well, you can spend money if you'd like to spend money on this stuff, that's great. And then you see that reflected in a lot of the casuals. I spent a non-negligible amount of time writing about and talking about Kim Kardashian Hollywood over the years. And that is a game that really centralizes like sort of consumption in every possible way that it can. And I'm not even, this is not me, dissing Kim Kardashian Hollywood. I spent a lot of time playing that game, but I think that it is in many ways very artful in its construction, but but it definitely sort of centralizes consumptive practices. And there are a lot of other games that sort of do that as well, that sort of centralize that consumptive moment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Animal Crossing is another good example.
Sure. I mean, yeah,
Right.
exactly.
I don't want to. I was going to go in a different direction, but I don't want to let this go. I want to kind of go back a little because you just in the beginning you just kind of jumped to the idea that women do tend to drift to more casual games in general, right? And that there were reasons for this related to simply the way that women have had to pursue leisure, right? But we haven't got to the, let's say, sociological or political explanation of that. And maybe would help to have a little bit of that in there.
I don't have like hard data to back this up, but one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about second wave feminism, and that moment in second wave feminism where women re-entering the workforce. And I say that word re-entering very gingerly here, because of course there were women that were always in the workforce. So Arlie Russell Hochschild talks about the second shift,
Right.
which was that women in the 1980s who had not previously been in the workforce were going back to the workforce or going to the workforce for the first time, but then still working a full-time job at managing the household. And so, and in some ways that has shifted, right? Like, I mean, there's, we're in a better place than we were in the 1980s in terms of that, certainly. And that's not to say that there aren't households that don't look like that, and that there aren't households that don't look like other things, but that certainly sort of set up a space where there just wasn't time for it, right? And even if you look back at sort of like earlier feminist works, if you look at something like Simone de Beauvoir or Mary Wollstonecraft or things like that, there's a lot of discussion about like, well, men see us as frivolous things, right? So there's this like sort of always this commentary on that question of frivolity, and I feel like that created some tension with this idea of play, right? Playing, it does imply a certain degree of frivolity. And so I think that all of those tensions together sort of constructed a space where, in order to be taken seriously, I think a lot of women sort of grew up in a culture where they were not necessarily playing, right? And again, your mileage may vary. I'm not making assumptions about all women everywhere. But I think that was one of the things that sort of, so, and as talking about that idea of the second shift, then you look at a game like Diner Dash, where you're working as a waitress in a restaurant, and I've described it as a third shift, where you work a full-time job in the office, you work a full-time job at home, and then you have a couple of hours at night, and you immediately jump into a labor-based activity of and specifically emotional labor-based activity, because the reality is that while if you're playing Grand Theft Auto, a heart signifies your health, but if you're playing Diner Dash, a heart signifies the love of others, and you're just trying to win over that love constantly.
Wow,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
What about games like, there's some other games that would sort of fall into this category, but maybe not quite so emotional, things like Farmville?
No, I mean, and so I've talked a bit about in some of my work about so those would be Invest Express games, right? Where you're investing time in order to cultivate, a space. And Invest Express games in many ways sort of like take all of the aspects of sort of like labor in play and emotional labor and all of these kind of messy things, and also consumptive practices, and sort of like tie them up in a neat bow and serve them to an audience. And so again, that's, we wonder, the question shouldn't be, why do women play Farmville? The question should be, why do companies try and make a Farmville for women, right? Like, why does that happen? How is it that we culturally design games in that way when we are assuming women are the targeted audience? And what does that mean in terms of our cultural perceptions of leisure and leisure equality and what we expect out of women for leisure? And some of that also is that, while women are about 50% of all video game players. The numbers vary, obviously, depending on who counts as a woman and what counts as video game and blah, blah.
Right.
But it ranges from anywhere from 46% to 52%. So I like to just split down the middle and say about 50%.
Yep.
And, but only 22% of the industry is people who identify as women. Right. And that includes, or at least the last time it was surveyed. And obviously those numbers may have changed. It's been a while since I think a good survey of those numbers have come out. And they've grown a lot. But when Farmville came out, it was closer to, that 22% number. So that means that there's a lot of people out there that are making games for audiences that are not themselves and building cultural assumptions into those games, right? Our technology isn't neutral and it reflects back what it is that we assume about those kinds of leisure practices.
Okay, so let me go back now, right, to the idea, your idea that the playful is political, right? Yeah. Right. I mean, we're used to think of playing as just, playing is about fun. So in what sense can play be political?
So that phrase, the playful is political, is one that I have gone through a lot of phases with, because so I first used it in 2014 for a fishbowl that I co-organized with Adrian Shaw that at the Digital Games Research Association, DIGRA. And originally it was just this light pun on the personal is political, right? We were just sort of riffing off of that. We didn't really have a whole lot in mind when we were putting that together. And the fishbowl, of course, became weirdly politicized and a central pivot in how in Gamergate and how we were how academia was complicit in all of the evils that were being asserted by the people who were talking about Gamergate. So I spent a non-negligible time thinking about that phrase, and then it became a title of my conclusion in Ready Player 2. And then I kind of ended Ready Player 2 with that sentiment, the playful is political, thinking about these things matter because play matters, because play and equality matters. And when I revisited the phrase again when I wrote Play Like a Feminist, because I've increasingly become interested in how play and leisure more broadly can be thought of as a mode of protest. So in Play Like a Feminist, I wrote this chapter, Play to Protest, and that was sort of the premise, but there was a two-part premise to it. The first was that play itself can be a form of protest, our choice to embrace leisure activities of both ourselves and of the folks around us gives us this opportunity to push back at the encroaching work-centric culture that many of us are attuned to, which I probably don't say it nearly as well as Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing, which I strongly recommend. And then second, that we can use play in political ways to make our protests better and more effective. So in Play Like a Feminist, I advocate for using playful tactics like alternate reality games or LARPs to educate and to perform protest and to add levity to our most dire issues.
Okay. Man, I like both of them. We're going to talk about the second one, the second one of these more, or at least I want to ask more. But let's get into Play Like a Feminist, right? So the title itself, or at least the project, seems to be motivated by the supposed insult of playing like a girl. Can you tell us a little bit about what that insult's supposed to be and how it's translated into the world of video games?
Yeah. So, I mean, I started that book. My start point for Play Like a Feminist was the title. I the phrase popped into my head. It was around 2017. And it really struck me. And it seemed sort of a good counter response to all of the feelings of impending doom that I had at that moment in 2017, which lol, that was a cute feeling of impending doom. I look back fondly on that doom. So my start point in the book was sort of this question of what does that mean? What does it mean to play like a feminist? What might that mean? And so to the point of that insult, I was really struck with the contrast of, first off, how the phrase play like a girl was deployed when I was a kid. So sort of being made fun of. And I talk about my experiences on the playground of being made fun of for being a girl, and versus decades later, when suddenly it's meant as a like phrase of empowerment. So like buy a menstrual pad advertisements in Nike, right? Like so but even that is this flawed idea of playing like a girl, right? It still concretizes what it means to be a girl, and it implies sort of this compulsory cisgenderedness to that empowerment, and sort of renders disability and age invisible, right? Like it just sort of like realigns different things, and it doesn't really say anything. This idea of like playing like a girl, whether it's an insult or a compliment, is just like it's messily poor.
Mhm.
And so then the idea to me of playing like a feminist is that we need to play in ways that transcend those physical and cultural boundaries, and consider like kinds of like a kind of leisure equality. So and some of that, as I see it, is it like can happen in video games. It's a space that was formerly dominated by masculinity, and that's like changing. It's like deeply in flux.
I'm tempted to ask about what play equality would exactly be here. What that idea would be. Can we give it a shot? I mean, there's so many ways to kind of define that, but did you have anything in mind?
I think that just like any kind of equality, it's a thing that you're constantly working towards, right? But to me, it's not just about playing more, which I think is part of it, but also it is about looking at the people in your life and seeing if they get enough play, and how to enable play of those around us, because it's not zero sum. And if our play is on the backs of others' labor, then then it is imperfect. I ended Play Like a Feminist with not to spoil everything, but I ended it with around 2017. I was making New Year's resolutions with my son, who was then I guess 7, and he or 6, maybe, I don't know. I can't do math, it's fine. And so he came over to me, and like he wasn't going to write his own resolutions, but then he wrote down my resolution for me, which was play more. And I was like, okay, so first of all, why didn't I think of that? Second of all, that's a really good resolution that, and it sort of, but it also hit me that it sort of made me sad, right? That my kid was telling me to play more as a person who studies play, and like, what does that mean? Right. And so I spent a lot of time sort of grappling with the meaning of that. And my play has always been complicated and embedded in work, because, as somebody who studies video games, as I'm sure, as both of you have experienced, right? Like you have this moment where you're playing a game and you ask yourself, is this work or is this play? What am I doing right now? Is this actually leisure? If I'm making notes in my head, am I working? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like anymore. So I think that's sort of the mess of it that I enjoyed thinking about. And Play Like a Feminist gave me kind of that opportunity to really tease out some of those ideas. I don't know that I came to, the conclusion of how to cure leisure equality for everyone, but I think that my goal wasn't about coming to big answers so much as like teasing that out, and also getting more people into the conversation, because I do feel like so many of our academic conversations become insular, and there are so many moments where, I mean, all of the scholars I know in my field have many, many times had these discussions about the value of games, but I think that a lot of times that doesn't happen outside. And so I wanted to expand that conversation, and I wanted to get feminists to think about play more.
There's so much that comes with the way we organize our lives and the relative time that we give to play. Before we actually move on to Play Like a Feminist, I want to ask a little bit more of that. Would it matter also the kind of games that we're playing? Is there equality? Do you think that, of course, when we say Play Like a Feminist, and of course I want to ask what kind of feminist, and, which, but, the idea itself of equality is so complicated. Right. And when we think about, not just the time, but yeah, if we go back to the type, does it matter what type? Do you think as a feminist it matters what kind of play we have?
I mean, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I want to say yes, right? Like play excellent things, but on the other hand, I also feel like who am I to tell somebody else how to enjoy their leisure, right? I don't
Right.
think that I get to do that, and I think that kind of gatekeeping doesn't serve anyone. So, like, do I have opinions about what good play looks like? Absolutely, but I don't think that pushing that on others is a good way to be an advocate.
Mm.
Right. And that follows into sort of the way that we think about fun, right? Because there's different kinds of fun, and different people want different kinds of fun at different times of the day, of their lives, or whatever. So it makes sense that sometimes you might want to have that, glass of wine before dinner fun, and sometimes you want to have the kill a Nazi fun.
Kill a Nazi fun, sure.
Well, like in a first-person shooter,
sure.
like a World War II, like that kind of like
I got that,
intense
yeah.
kind of fun, right? As opposed to the relaxing kind of fun.
Before we get into the connections more between video games and feminism, can you tell us a little bit about the sort of feminism you have in mind and what values or perspectives you bring to the table?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that question because I don't think that feminism is one thing. I very deliberately pluralize feminism when I use the term. But the definition of feminism that I use in the book is from Bell Hooks, rest in peace, that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. I don't see feminism as a movement about exclusion, but one about inclusion. So and that's what I would like to be advocating for. And I spend a lot of time thinking about Sarah Ahmed's notion that to live a feminist life is to make everything into something that is questionable. And so that was sort of where I come from with this, that I think that we need to call play and its value in our everyday lives into question. And because feminisms of the past have been so inextricably connected to those issues of gravity and importance, it like the core of my argument was that there needed to be more playtime in feminism.
More playtime in feminism, not just feminism focused on more, or feminism focused on more on playtime.
Yes, and right.
Yes,
like
and.
I think that all of these things can be in conversation, right? Like I think that a more playful feminism can serve us well, and I think that a feminism focusing on play can serve us well. And I think that all of these things can be together and in harmony in sort of my idyllic version of it, at least. Again, so I do feel like I always need the caveat. I wrote this book before the pandemic. So I, it's been tough on me to sort of like revisit some of that post-pandemic or mid-pandemic, I should say. I don't know, post, I don't know what I'm saying.
Right. Mid-pandemic.
Wherever we are. Yeah.
In the shadow of the pandemic.
So what's changed? Yeah.
I mean, so our leisure habits have continued to change as I see it, right? Like we're all, in my book, I sort of like cheekily wrote at one point that as I saw it during that time period, that there are two types of people in the world, people who love video games and people who don't know which video games they love yet, which I think is an excellent cheeky thing to say in 2017. But the reality is that once the pandemic really hit us, the truth of the matter is that there were two types of people in the world: people who had a surplus of free time because of the pandemic, and people who had absolutely no free time because of the pandemic.
Right.
And I found myself increasingly in that second category, and that really has changed my perspective on things. And I've found myself moving away from digital games a lot, and moving more towards board games in the pandemic. And at various points I've kind of fought it. I've tried to push myself to play more digital games, and then I've realized I can't gatekeep myself either.
That's interesting that in a pandemic, when you're when you're presumably, sheltered away from most of the contact you have with other people, that you gravitated towards games where you actually sit down with other people as opposed to games where you don't have to.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like some of it was just sort of, being around my family. My kid was finally at an age where he could play cool games, and
Okay.
where my kid and my husband and I can like sit around and play board games, and that felt more satisfying to me. So
Okay,
I
so
think,
it's within the pod you're talking about.
yeah, I
You're
wasn't,
not going
not,
out.
I'm not like going out,
Yeah, you're
not
not
to a
going to the
high
local
risk
game
situation
cafe.
by
You're not
board
having
gaming.
friends over. Right. So I get it now. Okay, that makes sense.
But
Yeah.
but that
It's
itself,
actually a way to spend family time. It's a way to do some quality sort of family time.
Yeah.
right. But it speaks to also maybe how leisure itself is formed by the constraints or freedoms in our lives, right? I mean, our family started playing a lot of, a lot of board games too, right?
Right.
Because that's what you can do with. It's much easier, especially I can't get my wife to play video games with me and my son, but it's very easy for us to all sit around a table and play a game. And we only have two controllers for the Xbox too, right?
Well, and also I can't enough stress that the screen aversion that has happened to me over the last couple of years
Yeah.
it is part of that, right? Like, I mean, I don't feel like sitting in front of screens in the evenings. In that way, right? Like, I mean, I might sometimes, but not in the way that I did before. And so I just found myself not really making space for that kind of play, but making space for other kinds of play. And so, we just started nurturing all of us an interest in board games and sort of figuring out, spending Saturdays playing Mansions of Madness, which is intense with a elementary school age child, admittedly. So I think that I'm still growing with it. And I imagine that there are a lot of people out there that are still figuring it out. And there are a lot of people out there that are barely making ends meet right now. And they sure don't have a lot of time to play. So, I mean, I think that issues of leisure equality have become even more exacerbated in the shadow of the pandemic.
This conversation has led me to sort of realize that even amongst myself and what you're talking about and what Shlomo was talking about the way with his family is leisure time gets sort of superimposed over other things that we also feel like we need to do, like, quality time with our family. We need to do that. We need to set aside time for that. But can it also be playful? Shopping is something we need to do. We need to go out and gather food and whatever we need. Can it also be playful? Is that something that's part of this? Is this something where the kind of leisure time that we present for women has more of that sort of overlap of things that you would do anyway?
I think so. I mean, I think that is certainly the pattern of it. And there's, again, like video games have really emulated that. And certainly video game advertising. One of my first journal articles that I ever wrote many years ago, I analyzed advertisements for the DS and the Wii when they first came out, and like magazine advertisements in like old school women's special interest magazines. So like Martha Stewart, wow, Oprah, and Real Simple were like running these ads. And some of so Nintendo had a campaign at the time that was "Do something with your nothing," which was a phrase that I just like found endlessly fascinating. And because it sort of implies you can play, but only when you got nothing else going on, right? You have 10 minutes in a doctor's office, do something with your nothing. But then we did this was, I thought, really interesting. They did a campaign called My Wee Story, and people were, they had a website set up and people would enter in their Wii stories about how the Wii revolutionized their life. And then they would turn the good ones into magazine ads. And the Wii stories were like, often they were just so centered around sort of this sort of play is love mentality, right? Like if you play with your family, they'll like you more. If you play video games with your family, they'll like you more. There's one that I remember, but a woman who was pregnant and was on bed rest for being pregnant, right? Like was unable to go out. And so like sort of the implication and that like the Wii saved her, and sort of the implication was that she was playing for two, right? So there's definitely sort of this history of that play can function as this kind of emotional labor, that it's both inside of the game world but also outside of the game world, right? Like that if you're playing, then that means that your kids will like you better. I think in one of the ads there was something like this is one of the magazine ads. A kid, the mom wrote something in her testimonial, something along the lines of, well, I made me and my kid said that that I should change it and make it look prettier because I'm prettier than that. And I'm like, okay, so what are we saying here, right? Like, what is the upshot of all of this? And I think that a lot of that was sort of marketing, certainly the Wii system, in that way that if you played with your family on the Wii, then it's not really don't worry about it. You're not being frivolous. You're actually just getting your family together. It's just that's all you're doing. You can calm down.
Is that some sort of puritanical sort of you live to work?
It feels like it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It certainly does feel that way. There was also another ad that I loved that I still reference in the classroom sometimes. Do you guys remember Brain Age? So at this, Brain Age put out advertisements in magazines at the same time, one in like Wired and Time and one in like Real Simple and Martha Stewart. And it was the masculine ad was like this bald dude with circuitry all over his head, and it was like how to be compelled in all caps, how to be something like did you know that a video game could help you compete with your coworker, right? Like, and it was like all futurism with the DS floating in the air and everything. And then the woman's ad was like a woman holding it was like this purple sweet looking ad. It was a woman holding a DS almost like it was a book and sort of like looking down on it. And it never used the phrase video game in the entire ad, and it said the Japanese secret of beauty or something like that. And then it offered the woman a 36-24-36 cerebrum.
Wow. Jesus. Who approved that campaign? What year is this?
2006, 2007?
Yeah,
wow.
something about that.
Okay.
Holy smokes.
Wow. Okay. All right. Let me get back here to.
I'm digressing a lot. I know.
I know, but
it's great.
so bringing us back, and that was priceless. Okay, so let's go back to the feminism aspect of this, right? What sort of guidance do you think feminism can give us here, and is it guidance for women, girls, or all players?
I mean, I think the advice here is that feminists they need to think more broadly about play and leisure as this issue of equality. It's not just about digital games. It includes them, but it's not just about that. And that, so like for a long time, I felt like I had this robust history of talking to women who would consider themselves feminists, and they would be really dismissive when I tell them what I studied, where they would be like, oh, I don't have time for play, or video games are so violent. Why would you do that? Right. But like, we all have time for play. We need to make time for play. We need to make room in our lives for of the people that we love, to help them find that play. And it is an issue of equality, right? Like, and it's one that we just don't talk about that much. So, and games are part of that. And I want to see more feminists playing video games, but I also want to see more feminists embracing board games, and more feminists thinking about how to build leisure into their own lives and the lives of those around them. And I don't see that as being a gender exclusive issue, although historically in the West, women have this, like, again, I already said it, this complicated relationship with leisure and play.
Is there anything, the industry or game makers can do? Is this just a kind of a way that we need to think socially about games, or personally about the role of fun in our lives? Or is this something that game designers themselves could be thinking about?
I mean, I think we need more women playing games so that we get more women interested in making games in order to make games better, right? Like it's the cycle of it, right? Because of course, I mean, it's a passion job, it's a passion industry. Nobody's going to go into the video game industry if they don't actually already love video games. And so there's just that habit of everybody continually making the same things, and not the same things, but the same kinds of things, and that it thwarts innovation. And so, I mean, I don't think there's any one thing that the industry can do so much as I think that it needs to be on both sides of it, right? And that was sort of my thought with the idea of gaming circles when I talked about them, was that like if more of us played, then we become a market. And if we become a market, I mean and I definitely have gotten some critiques in the book about the fact that I did not go anti-capitalist in my sentiment, but like as a market, there is some power,
And that's sort of interesting too, because one of the typical sort of aspects that we assign to femininity is to do things for other people. Mm-hmm. And so even when women get in the industry, I think it's easier for them to make games for somebody that's not themselves.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting point.
Because certainly, like, we all get in the industry and we all have ideas for games, but almost none of us actually get to make the games that we want to do. We're always making games for somebody else, and it's good to be able to like do that, right? We're good to be able to. It's a good design quality, a good quality for a designer to be able to make a game that's fun for a demographic that's not themselves.
Sure.
But frequently, that's dictated by market,
right?
Which means that it's going to be somebody who looks more like me than it is that it looks more like you.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, it shouldn't be, right? Because as you say, 50% of the game playing market is female. But
there's also a lot of sort of demeaning of what, free-to-play games get such a bad rap, right? But the reality of free-to-play games is that they are a really good space if you are not yet ready to be committed to spending money. And I know that there are all kinds of predatory practices, and I'm not diminishing that,
right,
but they're not all predatory, right? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of free-to-play games out there that are not predatory, and that it allows people to try before you buy.
Yeah.
And that is a practice that helps, because the reality is that if I talk to someone and I say, hey, you need to play more games, they're not going to run out and spend, $300 on a system and buy a bunch of $60 games. That's absurd. No, they're going to start with, you start where you live, right? Everybody has a phone, not everybody, but a lot of people have, smartphones mm-hmm. that they can, we all have small gaming systems in our lives now. And that's an amazing thing that we can do to just start slowly integrating games in. And I think that there are some low level ways that we can just start getting more people to play games. And so, one of the things that I really tried to do when the book was coming out, before the book came out, I guess less so since the pandemic, but was become a sort of an evangelist of it, right? Like having conversations with people, and when they would say, oh, I don't play video games, be like, why? What don't you like? And then helping them sort of like, helping them becoming their sommelier of games, right? Like, figuring out what it is that maybe they'd like and giving them recommendations, because, I do think that there are, I have found that one of the first things to ask and I have definitely converted some people who thought they hated video games into loving video games. And, so one of the first questions that you ask is always this question of like, do you prefer stories or puzzles? Right. And if somebody says story, then I usually send them to Florence, because that's like such an easy thing to start with. It feels like a short story, and you have just like that light level of interactivity. It's not, it's very, there's no challenge to it, but it still is a meaningful enough story that you feel complicit in it, and you feel like there's some good moments in it. Mm-hmm. And if they say puzzle, I usually say Monument Valley. Mm-hmm. Because,
such a smart game,
right? And beautiful game.
Yeah. So I'm actually playing it right now with my son. Monument Valley. Yeah.
It's great.
The second one, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a gorgeous game, and it's just so it really, and that was sort of a moment that happened around around 2017 after Ready Player 2 came out. There was a shift, right? Like, so previously a lot of people who would never have liked video games or would say that, suddenly I would tell them what I study and they'd be like, oh, cool. And they would start asking me questions, or they would ask me for recommendations. Or like at one point, I was at a birthday party and I was like chatting with a random mom, and she started telling me about how 3 generations of her family play Clash of Clans. And, so I started hearing more of these stories. And then there was like this moment where I started recommending games more and more. And I would have women come back to me and say, I didn't know that games like that existed. And I realized that there's so much insider baseball, right? Like, I mean, it's just like, we know that there are like these artful, literary, cool, weird games, right? That it's not just Grand Theft Auto and Super Mario, but like there are people out there that have no idea. And how do we get the word out? How do we get them to have these experiences, and can these experiences change their lives or make their lives a little bit better, either for a short period or a longer period? And that's sort of where that was where a lot of that came from.
I want to ask about the gaming circles, right? First of all, can you explain for our audience what a gaming circle is?
As I said, like previously, like there was that moment where people increasingly were saying to me, I didn't know that games like that existed. And it really, like, it shook me when I heard that, because I think that if feminists are going to get more invested in play and to play more, they need to get some buy-in to the market and to be able to articulate what they do and don't like. And so, I mean, the gaming circles function like a book club. Everyone picks a game, and once a month a group meets up, virtually now, I suppose that would be the way to do it, to talk about games and to think about them in more literary ways. And I made a compendium website to go with it, so that and lists different games and different sort of play styles of games, and had some questions for like book style, club style questions.
So is this something that I'm very naive here, right? Because before you, I've never heard of the gaming circle. I'm assuming designers do stuff like this, Andy. Or is this?
Well, it kind of happens for us naturally, just by proximity.
Right. Right.
It sounds, what she's describing is something a lot more
like a book club
designed, right, than what happens with us.
Right. So,
well, I think that a large part of the problem is a question of vocabulary, right? And also like safe spaces. Because if somebody were going to go to their kid and say, I don't know anything about video games, I guess, can you show me? Then first of all, they're going to get it curated by their kid, which could go any number of directions. And second of all, like, there's sort of that insecurity of like, you don't want to look dumb. You don't want to try something new and then feel like stupid about it.
Right.
Nobody wants that. And so this creates a safe space.
Right.
And helps people build a vocabulary, because as you build vocabulary, you are able to articulate what it is that you like.
Interesting. So, what is the goal here, right? Because if we're starting, let's say, at the point where women are almost half of players, is the idea to expand the range of games that or kinds of games that they're familiar with? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I mean, like, I would like to see a world where there were more women out there and more players out there that or like sort of non-traditional gamers out there, not necessarily just women, but non-traditional gamers,
right,
that know about the artful and literary games, that know about the indie games, right? Like, I mean, and that's not to say that like Candy Crush doesn't have its value, but that Candy Crush isn't the extent of it. That there is as much depth as you want to find, and that you can have satisfying experiences playing games if you have not previously.
It is really interesting to me because I've been fascinated by the fact that that most of my female friends are part of book clubs, and none of my male friends are ever part of book clubs. And it's one of those things that my sadness for what seems to be men and boys reading a lot less these days, but also that I feel like so many men miss out on the book club experience. And I'm wondering if I really like the idea of doing something like that with video games, right?
Yeah, it didn't, it's one of those things where, I started this thing and it maybe started at the wrong moment, right? Like, I mean, the reality is that having a book come out in 2020 is a tricky, space. But I think that even without doing it as a circle in a really official way, there are ways to sort of like find people who are game curious and pull them in, and try to, help them figure out what might improve their lives, right? It's all just about improving our lives, making our experience of living better. And I think that people that are already embedded in the industry know that video games have the power to do that. It's, there are just a lot of people that haven't quite gotten there yet, or are interested but just don't know how to get there. And so that was the premise. That was where I was coming from on it.
But that's sort of interesting too, right? Because that makes playing games another form of sort of self-help, which is again not leisure.
Well, is it? I mean, in a sense, you're right.
I repaint my house because I want my life to be better. I spend time learning a new skill because I want my life to be better.
Increasingly, I'm pushing away from having a one size fits all definition of leisure, because the reality is that, like, our experiences are so unique, right? Like, but I think that, the point of any activity that, play or leisure activity to some extent is to improve, to make your life better. I don't know about it, self-improvement in the sense of self-help, but make your life better, right? Like, most people don't do leisure activities not planning on doing that.
Yeah, it's weird, and because on the one hand, I definitely see the idea of you want fun to be simply for fun's sake, but I'm always going to ask, but what's the value of that? And if you get to the point where your life is just better, right, when you have fun, right, then I don't know if it makes a difference if fun is instrumental or just intrinsically good.
It's just such a strange selling point, though, right? Like, you go have fun because it'll make your life better.
Sounds like the best selling point ever. You're telling me that my life would be better if I just go have fun. It's a win-win. Okay, Shira. So we talked about how feminism can help us really think about games and the importance of leisure. What do video games have to offer for feminism?
So in our political fights, we need to learn how to game things out better. We need to glitch out vulnerabilities, and we need to mod the game and make new games and tease out problems and find ways to do things differently. And no one knows how to glitch out a game better than a gamer. By training feminists to be gamers, we're essentially training them to be more effective about thinking about systems of oppression and structures that can be beaten. I like to think of it that video games are like agentic training machines. So agency, of course, is a term used by activists and scholars to articulate like that process of taking action, specifically against systems of power. And but also agency is a term that we talk about in video game design, right? It's our will to act, to become part of the system while pushing against it. Without that agency, the player loses the game. So in the real world, we need to feel our agency to affect change, and thinking about games can help us get there.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely.
All right. Sounds great. All right. Thank you, Shira. Dr. Shira Chess from the University of Georgia. Check out her books, Play Like a Feminist and Ready Player 2. Shira, thank you very much for coming on our show. Good podcast. Play nice, everybody.